This is the second edition of the summer school. It's a bit larger than last year, and it's a bit more professional, I guess. And there's also a number of people that aren't sort of our personal close friends, whilst last year was mostly our personally close friends around, which means that it's sort of a different challenge. But I'm quite confident that we'll be able to make it into a fruitful event this year as well. And I think it's important to underline, as Alex said as well, that although there's a lot of students here, this is not an academic event, right? We're not going to structure it as a series of lectures where people take notes and listen and absorb, but we want to sort of to make it as participatory and as interactive as possible, and we want it to be an event where we learn from each other and where we co-produce knowledge of things that we don't yet know anything about. There might be people who are older than others, there might be people who are more academically qualified than others, who look more intimidating than others, and all these sorts of things. But I want everybody to, as far as possible, to at least keep the sort of the fiction of equality intact during these days, in a sense, right? To sort of understand, in a way, we're all in this together, in a way. I think that the theme of the summer school is quite timely this year. Now the video of the retweet networks has stopped, but now it's started again, I think. And as you can see, these are the retweet networks on Twitter following the announcement of what announcement is it? What did Mubarak do? Mubarak resigning. The retweet networks around the announcement of Mubarak resigning, and it's an interesting image from a whole series of points of view. It's an interesting image, of course, because it shows sort of a diffusion of news and a diffusion of sort of a viral diffusion of a political message as it travels around these networks. But it's also really interesting because it's perhaps the first time that you can actually observe this, right? Because there are two sides to social media, of course, right? One side is, of course, that they are enabling, in a perhaps more technologically sophisticated way, the diffusion of information and the diffusion of communication around political mobilization, which previously was more difficult, although not impossible in any way, because, of course, different other types of media technologies, like the samizdat technologies in the former Soviet Union, or the pamphlets that were circulating in 18th century France before the French Revolution, radio, which Tiziano no doubt will talk more about in a couple of days, have had this role for a long time. So there's really nothing, at least to my mind, there's really nothing exclusive and new about social media. What might be exclusive and new about social media is that the power to communicate and the power to distribute these types of information has been diffused and socialized to an unprecedented extent. What might be really new about social media, though, is that these things become visible and can be observed and can be theorized by us, but can also be observed by the people who are in power, which of course is a really interesting thing, right? It's actually possible to use new media not only to mobilize against Mubarak, but it's also possible, and it happened, that the Egyptian secret police can follow tweets and retweets in order to identify and try to predict where the intensities of protests and revolt will be. So in many ways, it's an ambiguous instrument, right? But it seems to definitely be the instrument around which what now seems to be a new wave of social mobilization might reasonably be expected to travel on. Right? And when we thought about this summer school this winter, we were of course impressed by the so-called Arab Spring and the seemingly inexplicable and sudden movements of uprisings and protests and movements in Tunisia and Egypt, in Libya and so forth. But since then, this thing has, of course, been spreading, right? It's been spreading to Spain, where we've had big movements of so-called indignados who have been using social media to organize protests against poverty, precarious working conditions, and the general inability of the Spanish government to model through what seems to be closing up to a fiscal collapse of the Spanish state. We had it in London a couple of weeks ago. although perhaps less ideologically motivated, but definitely a clear reaction towards against 4 years of economic downturn, unemployment, worsening conditions, and then in addition to that, a sort of extra sort of repressive squeeze that David Cameron put on after coming into government. It's actually quite almost mathematical in the precision with which the London riots subsede by 4 years the onset of the repression in 2007. If you remember, it was the same thing in 1995, 4 years after 1991, and in 1982, 4 years after 1978. It seems like UK society is sort of a static sociological model whereby 4 years after the onset of a recession, you get riots in one way or another. And we're definitely going to get it in Italy now, as you probably all of you observed. Italy is at the forefront of the overall collapse of globalized neoliberalism that we're observing around us. The sort of the second wave of the financial crisis, which is now acting on sovereign debt and which is going probably to quite radically restructure systems of power and state apparatuses and state power as far as we know, as we know it and as we're used to it, and it's also going to, I think, quite radically restructure systems of economic power within the corporate economy, because it's quite obvious for most of us that the types of corporations that were central in creating wealth and creating a democratized wealth in the industrial economy aren't really creating wealth at all anymore. If you look at the figures of the profits of the Standard & Poor 500, you could see that about 70% of the profits of these companies are financial profits, but the profits that they make from actually producing and selling things are becoming smaller and smaller. So it becomes sort of quite evident that the corporate economy is not sort of particularly good at creating and distributing things that are useful or perceived as useful for most people. Not to speak of sustainability, ecological sustainability, social sustainability, and all these other types of issues. Right? So I think it's quite likely to say that we're now entering into a period of the length of which nobody really knows. It might be a matter of 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, who knows, of a very quite profound restructuring of the global economic and political system, which might be quite comparable to, well, it depends, of course, on your level of radicality. I like to speak about the 18th century and the disappearance of feudalism and the emergence of a bourgeois capitalist civilization as a possible point of comparison, but we could talk more about that around the summer school. And Italy, in a sense, is at the forefront of this, of course, as you've noticed, by being commiserated by the European Central Bank and by sort of getting together as a bunch of spoiled children caught cheating in the cookie jar. Italian political establishment managed to sort of wade off speculation on Italian state bonds by cancelling 4 public holidays or something similar, which is probably not going to do the trick in the following months or half year. So it's quite likely that we're going to find ourselves in the middle of a new storm before the end of this year. And at the same time, the Italian economy suffers from about 5 years of negative economic growth. We have employment rates that are among the highest in Europe, and particularly among university graduates. And we don't have a government, and we don't have a prospect of ever having one in the immediate future, which is sort of sets the stage for quite radical revulsions, so to say, in the Italian social fabric. And it's quite interesting to see the way in which the role that social media might play in that. The focus that we want to bring to this summer school, and particularly to the second half of it, has to do with a slightly different take on this, right? And it's a take that Alex and I have been working with for some years, which is basically about the idea of social innovation, or we call it Societing because it's sort of a trendy brand that we've been stealing basically from someone else, but then using on our own. But the idea basically is that in the situation that we're in right now, a fruitful strategy of action is probably not so much to try to resist because what you want to resist is already crumbling on its own, in a sense, right? So a fruitful line of action is probably more to start thinking about how can you construct an alternative, right? And how can you use all these new types of resources that we have at our disposition, social media, peer production, social economies, social enterprise, alternative currencies, the internet, you name it, right? To create sort of from below a different type of paradigm of social and economic and political organization. And how can we envision that type of paradigm to interact with established political institutions, established economic institutions, and so on. Right? So that's the type of focus that we're trying to push into, and that's the type of focus that we've been wanting to develop in the summer school, particularly towards the second half. Right?